doing today?
Great, thank you.
It's great to see all of you all. So I'm actually really excited about this panel discussion today. I mean, really, hopefully we'll turn into a community conversation. I believe I have either reached out to all of you all in some form of capacity, whether it's been working for a faith-based institution and trying to start up some food equity programs there, or if it's getting some information about planning and zoning and how to integrate more equitable policies around food equity, or if it's even just partnering and lecturing with the University of Maryland and talking about the work that we do. So I think this will, I'm very excited about this conversation, and I will, can't wait to get started. Would everyone like to go around? I'll just introduce myself really quickly. I'm Brittney Drakeford. I'm currently a student at the University of Maryland in the Urban Planning and Regional Design program. I also am a member of the Prince George's County Food Equity Council, working to focus primarily on zoning and equitable zoning policies as it relates to land use and land development. So Heather, would you like to take it off with introductions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. My name is Heather Bruskin. I'm the Executive Director of the Montgomery County Food Council in Montgomery County, Maryland. And would you like me to share more about the organization now, or will we come to that later?
Let's just do quick introductions just for everyone, and then we can go into some more detailed questions about your organizations.
Thank you.
So Sha'Von, would you like to go next?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sha'Von Terrell, the Deputy Director of the Black Church Food Security Network, and I am so excited to be here with you all on today.
Thank you. And then Alice.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Alice Huang. I am the Food Access Planner in the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative. We are part of the Department of Planning for Baltimore City. So thanks for having me.
Thank you all so much. So, so again, thank you for being here today and for taking some time to discuss food equity. I know food equity has been a very important conversation that we've been having lately, particularly during the COVID pandemic, and thinking about ways that we can make more sustainable and resilient communities. One in being just providing opportunities for food production, but then also looking at the food system and distributing food to residents, particularly those who are in need. So just to start off, can you all please just tell us a little bit about yourselves and your work and how it relates to food justice? So Heather, you can start off.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity again to be a part of this conversation and be alongside all of these amazing colleagues. So again, my name is Heather Bruskin and I'm with the Montgomery County Food Council. So we're an independent nonprofit and we were founded 8 years ago and serve as the primary convener of government leaders and agencies, nonprofit organizations, businesses, and residents around food system issues in our county. And we have a small staff of 7, but we work in partnership with 25 volunteer council members and over 300 community partners who regularly engage in our initiatives and 4 working groups, which focus on food access and recovery, food economy, food education, and environmental impact. However, we regularly convene outside of those silos to ensure that our programmatic and advocacy work is as collaborative, streamlined, and systems focused as possible. So we're not a direct service provider, but we work really closely with our county's over 110 food assistance providers, who about half of those are faith-based community organizations, as well as many other different stakeholders in the work of our organization. And so Montgomery County has long been considered a county of significant financial means, one of the wealthiest in the country, but we're also home to a number of the county's or the country's most diverse communities. But tremendous income inequities exist in our county and have grown over time. And the number of households in our county with residents living below the poverty line has even post-COVID, pre-COVID has been really rising in recent times, even though that's not the case with some of our neighboring jurisdictions. And we also have a high cost of living in Montgomery County. So a family of four need over $91,000 a year just to cover basic needs. And so the COVID pandemic has only exacerbated all of these challenges. And now we're estimated to have over 100,000 residents who are food insecure. And so that's coming from 60,000 pre-COVID. And the health impacts of hunger disproportionately affect our county's children and people of color. According to the Maryland Department of Health and the Maryland Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which was administered before the pandemic, found that 18% of middle school and 22% of high school students in Montgomery County are food insecure. And African-American students are 5 times more likely, and Hispanic Latino students are 6 times more likely to be food insecure compared to their white peers. And the most recent revised Feeding America projection is 13%. So that's, again, a 62% increase in food insecurity from pre-COVID levels. And then finally, systemic racial inequities in our country have created deep disparities throughout our food, economic, and public health systems. And our mission is to bring our community together to collaboratively cultivate a robust, sustainable, and equitable local food system in our county through both policy and process change.
So I guess.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Sha'Von.
So first of all, I want to applaud the phenomenal work that Heather and her team are currently doing in Montgomery County. So with the Black Church Food Security Network, our mission is to build community-based food systems anchored by the resources and the assets that are found in the Black church community and in partnership with Black farmers. So our mission aligns with food sovereignty more than food justice. We want to make sure that those who are disproportionately and directly impacted by the inequities of the food system and food insecurity are the ones who are leading the efforts in creating sustainable solutions. So we were actually founded in 2015. So we are in our 5th year as an organization. And we were founded in the midst of the Baltimore uprising. So if anyone is familiar with the Baltimore uprising, a lot of the MTA bus public transportation services were shut down during the Baltimore uprising. And a lot of the neighborhoods who were affected, or a lot of the neighborhoods who depended on those public transportation options were located in healthy food priority areas or food apartheid areas, or some people may call them food deserts. So their only line of getting access to healthy food was dependent on those transportation services. So a lot of the community leaders reached out to the founder of the Black Church Food Security Network, Dr. Brown, to transport fresh produce, fresh food to those communities during the uprising. And then as a result of that, the Black Church Food Security Network was founded because one of the things that we realized is that the Black church has the resources and the assets to always anchor their community in times of crisis and in times of non-crisis. So we are doing that by partnering with churches to start community gardens and farmers markets on church-owned land. And I can talk more about how we are advancing food sovereignty in our communities.
Thank you so much. Alice?
Yeah, so I'm really thankful to be speaking with these two women, and Sha'Von out of the Black Church Food Security Network. I know we also do a lot of work with her and Dr. Brown. So the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative, we are a part of government. We're part of the Department of Planning, and we focus really on food policy and food planning within Baltimore City, and that includes food environment mapping. And so our office, we're really committed to building an equitable and resilient urban food system. And our goal is to really use food as a catalyst to address health, economic, and environmental disparities in healthy food priority areas. And so I think a lot of the work that we do, we are really trying to figure out how we can continue to use a racial equity lens in how we think about the work that we do. And so some of the components of that, while we do interagency collaboration, where we do work closely with other agencies in the city to be able to really advance these issues, whether it's about land tenure, whether it's about how food and food purchasing and institutional buying power is being implemented in other agencies in Baltimore City, and just a whole slew, and even how federal nutrition benefits impact how different agencies are serving food throughout different parts of the city. So we really think about that as we are kind of advancing this issue about food justice. And especially during COVID, we've been seeing that things have changed drastically in terms of food insecurity. And so for us as an office, while we do focus primarily on policy and planning, we have really been mobilizing ourselves as emergency response, doing a lot in terms of really organizing and distributing food boxes throughout the city, working with other agencies to work on meal distribution, and to really figure out how we can also continue to support urban agriculture, because we do believe that as COVID continues, resiliency is a huge issue that we need to continue to think about. And so urban agriculture, in addition to federal nutrition benefits, are things that are ongoing. And just to give people some background, we've seen a 25% increase in food insecurity in Baltimore City. And in February, we had 153,000 individuals receiving SNAP in Baltimore City. And now we're currently at 195,000. And so those numbers are really evidence, I guess, that really shows that food insecurity is on the rise, and it's really becoming a priority as we continue to try to address the needs of residents in Baltimore City during COVID. And I could talk more as we go in this conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, I think the three perspectives really help ground us in the conversation. There are a lot of key terms. I feel like I need to just take some notes and start to define some terms and keep a list of running terms to support myself during the conversation. And I know that'll be helpful for future conversations around food justice, food sovereignty, which is a new term, and then also thinking about the concepts around land tenure. So if you all can just take some time, and Alice, I'll start with you for this question, to please describe what a just food system looks like to you, and what can we do to overcome food apartheid and advancing food justice? I mean, what is something that you think might be most overlooked by food justice advocates today?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I think when we think about food justice, it really is the entire system. I think often we focus very closely on one issue or one proponent or one piece of the conversation, when there's all these other moving pieces. So for example, if we are talking about corner stores and really talking about how corner stores and what they supply into their communities are not healthy or is not fresh, I think in addition to talking about the stores themselves and the owners, there's also conversations that we need to have about the entire sourcing, like how food moves, and what can these store owners afford, and the wholesale price of these items, and if they can really afford buying in bulk, do they have storage for that, and how do we source affordable produce into these stores? And so I think often we kind of hone in on this one specific thing when it's really this huge system. And we really need to be working together with other partners to really keep all these moving pieces kind of connected and having this larger conversation. And so I think when we talk about food justice, we really need to think from like the farmer to the store to selling to to food waste and food recovery. And I think if we lose sight of understanding the whole system, then just pinpointing things on one piece, it's really hard to move one piece as a standalone. And I think the other thing that I think that we often kind of forget, I think it's really easy, especially what I've seen in COVID, it's really easy to have an immediate response where we need to get food to people. Let's rely on food pantries and let's rely on charity. But when we really are thinking about this, COVID is with us for a while. It's going to be with us for a while. And so how are we thinking about long-term sustainability? How are we thinking about thriving? And as we think about food justice and racial equity, I think one of the pieces that we really need to think about are what are the unintended consequences that we are going to have to think about as we keep thinking about emergency response? And is there a value in pivoting away from emergency response mindset and thinking about what is long-term sustainability and thriving as we continue to still try to figure out how to address people's needs? And so those are kind of the big things that come to mind.
Alice, I think those are really good points, especially around the idea of, COVID being with us. And as we're thinking about how we build more equitable food systems, and even honestly, probably even prior to COVID, and how do we move from thinking about emergency response, and how do we think about more root cause solutions? So Sha'Von, I'll turn it over to you to answer that question. You mentioned food sovereignty. And so thinking about food sovereignty, food apartheid, what does a just food system look like to you, and how can we overcome it? And what is some of the work that you all have been doing with the Black Church Security Food Network?
Yeah, so like Alice said, that question is loaded. So please be patient with me, because I have a couple of definitions for y'all, just to add clarity around food sovereignty, because sovereignty by itself is a loaded word, and apartheid, and then connecting that to food. So to answer your first question around what does a just food system looks like to me, and to the work of the Black Church Food Security Network, and to our team, a just food system looks like a sovereign food system, where the people are able to control the food that are coming in and out of their communities, and partnership with the farmers who grow the food. So food apartheid is like, what are the root causes? How do we get to the point of like food insecurity, and what does that look like systemically? So food apartheid is the systemic self-destruction of self-determination to control our food, whether by the exclusion of agricultural industries, lack of access to arable lands and healthy food, predatory marketing, capitalism, or other racist or discriminatory food systems that is impacted by the marketing, segregation, concentration, or low rates of land ownership. So how we are aiming to combat food apartheid is by ensuring that our program is rooted within the institution of each community. So when you look at various communities across America, regardless of what type of neighborhood that you're in, there is always a community anchor there. And the community anchor that we have identified as a Black community is the Black church, is the church. I am a graduate of 2 HBCUs, historically Black colleges, Tuskegee University and Morgan State University. And both of those schools have roots in the church. Morgan State University was founded because a group of ministers in the city came together and said, we need to put our resources together to educate our communities. And Tuskegee University, the first classes were held in the church. So getting back to the church being an anchor of the community, and using what we have collectively to really change the conditions of our communities. So a lot of churches have land that goes underutilized, that they just use just to mow the grass, pre-picnics, anniversaries. But what does that look like for us to lease the land to farmers, new and beginner farmers, so they can come in and grow the food for the congregation as well as for the surrounding community? Or what does it look like to transform a dining hall into a farmer's market that create niche markets within a community to support the business of farming? And then also, like, we are in middle of a unprecedented time, COVID-19, and a lot of churches have pivoted to food pantries, food distribution programs. But what does it look like for churches to source their produce, to source their items for their food pantries from Black farmers? And that right there is getting to food sovereignty, supporting those who grow the food through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. Also ensuring that the food is culturally appropriate. So the churches will ask those key questions to those farmers, like, how do you grow the food? How is the food being sourced? How is the food being processed to create a more just food system?
Yeah, thank you so much for for explaining those concepts. I mean, and when I hear you talk about growing food, and really through growing food with the churches and using churches as an anchor institution, also as, fresh food, not just bringing fresh food to communities, but also food sovereignty being and using the Black church as a mechanism to provide jobs and almost spur economic development, locally in a hyper-local way. So, I know we're going to explore more of this concept as, with our discussion. And again, to the people in the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to, enter your questions into the chat box. We'll take those. There will be a question and answer portion towards the end of this discussion. So Heather, would you like to jump in and talk about what a just food system looks like to you?
Yeah, thank you so much. So in our Food Council and in Montgomery County's communities, we typically define food security and food justice as our community being a place where all people at all times have access to safe, sufficient, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food with dignity. And I want to reflect too what Alice shared about how food justice, to me, really looks at the interconnectedness of our food system and our cycle, beginning with the production and where it's distributed and how it's distributed and how people access that food. And then also really getting to the final piece of that cycle and what happens with our food waste, and recognizing that, for example, in Montgomery County, historically, we have used an incinerator where a lot of our food waste is being burned, and we are transitioning away from that model now. But then what happens with the waste from that food, and often it disproportionately impacts residents living in low-income communities. And so it's important to look at each step in that cycle and how they all connect together. And we also in the Food Council are really making sure that we regularly recognize that we're striving to build equity in a food system that has, since its very beginning, been established and reinforced structural racism and social injustice. And so we regularly rededicate ourselves, both as professionals and as an organization, to creating and strengthening pathways for those who've been marginalized by our food system to direct the policies and programs that will rebuild this broken system. And we strive to convene discussions that prioritize the expertise and the leadership of people of color in facilitating that system's change. I also want to specifically look briefly at some of the work that we've been doing related to COVID response, and also recognizing that I think their response efforts are often focused on being fast, and fast is not often the easiest way to do things equitably and in a justice-oriented way. But we have been striving to both do actions that can meet immediate needs, but also build our long-term resilience. And some of those investments have been through grant programs that are supporting increased resident and community gardening capacity. So really encouraging partnerships or resident-led programs, investing in local farms with a priority of increasing long-term access to land for BIPOC farmers and for those that produce foods that reflect the diverse cultural traditions of our residents, as well as investing in food assistance providers who maybe actually weren't doing food work at all, but were trusted community partners who were connected with residents who maybe weren't accessing food assistance resources before, but for the first time finds themselves in food insecure situations, and were able to really invest in those community organizations who can have those trusted relationships to identify the unique needs and opportunities and challenges in their neighborhoods. And finally, I think as a white woman in a leadership role in an organization and a community, it's my goal to continually prioritize my own self-work and education and racial equity with a focus on listening to be a more effective ally and partner in this work. And so our board and staff have recently completed a year-long equity action program, and for the past 6 months have been developing our own organizational strategic plan to both dismantle racism in our organization as well as our local food system. And so I think we recognize that there's significant work ahead for us, but that ultimately we want to encourage feedback and open dialogue about how the Food Council can work more effectively in food justice work as well.
Okay, thank you. I do have just one follow-up question. So you mentioned that there's some organizations, Heather, that you all have that may not have worked in the food space before, but are now starting to work in the food space because they're trusted institutions. Can you just, and you don't have to name specific names, but can you just, toss out generally some ideas of what organizations those may be, in case any of the audience members may be trying to think where they can develop some new partnerships?
Yeah, absolutely. And in so many of the difficulties that surrounded those early months of the pandemic, I think the number of organizations and businesses that were stepping forward to say that they wanted to be a partner in making sure that all of their program participants or their neighbors or their community residents had access to food, and was probably, one of the most inspiring things that I saw. And so that was everything from soccer programs, who weren't running any soccer leagues, but or other youth sports groups, or had been working with youth athletes, who suddenly, had been maybe getting nutritious meals at school and were suddenly not able to be exercising or being a part of their regular athletic programs. And so these were coaches who were concerned about the health of the youth that they were working with. So that's just one example. But a lot of these were faith communities that maybe had small food ministry programs before, but really saw a gap in available resources in their community. So certainly churches and other faith groups. But then also we would have groups that would in our government agencies, it was everything from libraries to the Department of Recreation or other groups that are regularly engaging with residents on a daily basis. And as these centers closed, they saw spaces that really needed to be filled in by with community resources. So I'm happy to talk about partnerships more in depth later, but that's just a couple examples that come to mind of groups that were funded to do food security work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. So also earlier this year, during the legislative session, the Action Network focused on supporting bills that related to food justice. One of these bills stipulated that the state of Maryland reduce greenhouse emissions from Maryland's food purchases by 25% by the year 2030. So what do you all think? Is food justice also climate justice? How synergistic are these two movements? And again, for this round, I'll start off with Alice.
Sure. So I do really think that there is a lot of correlation between food access, food justice, and climate justice. I think when you look at specifically, we're looking at Baltimore City, and we look at heat maps and just where a lot of what parts of the city are most impacted by climate change, and we do see that there is a correlation that the areas that are most impacted by climate change and by these heat islands are also the areas that are considered healthy food priority areas. And so I think we are thinking that these areas that are impacted a lot by poverty and other issues, they do line up and they are impacted by these multiple sectors. And so I think that there is something to be said about how all this correlates. But I also think that when we think about climate change and we think about climate justice, we do have to think about how we're purchasing food and how we're sourcing. And so I will say that when we think about good food purchasing, I don't know if folks have heard that term before, but when we think about institutional buying power and how people are choosing the contracts that they're implementing to buy food, part of it is supporting local economies and nutritional value and workforce and animal welfare, but one of their primary tenets is environmental sustainability, and that looks at food waste, that looks at carbon emissions. And so for us, I think we do really think that that is a value, and we are continuing to figure out how we can continue to move forward in good food purchasing as a city, and thinking through how are contracts being used to support local farms, local product, really thinking about how much of our product, schools and city government, how much of what we're purchasing is within a certain radius of where we are. And I think that really lines up with kind of our value for wanting to move in that direction of valuing climate justice as we continue to make decisions around food.
All right. Thank you so much, Alice. Yeah.
Heather
or Sha'Von, do you all have anything else to add to that particular to this particular question? So is food justice also climate justice?
So I agree with everything that Alice has said. I actually have a quote that I want to lift up by Audre Lorde, And the quote is, "There is no thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So with that being said, I believe that food justice intersects with almost everything, right? It intersects with climate justice, environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice. And that's why our passions is just rooted in allowing people to define and redefine their food system to ensure, like I mentioned before, our mission is that those who are directly impacted are the ones who are um, leading and rebuilding sustainable and equitable food systems. So what the food sovereignty lens that we seek to promote aims to do is prioritize local buying. So when we source produce from farmers, our first outreach is to farmers within the Maryland area, and specifically in Baltimore, because that's where our headquarters are, to keep those food travel miles as low as possible. But even before that, like even when the pandemic first started, we mailed seeds to people because we wanted to make sure that people have the resources that they need in order to grow their own food. Because when the pandemic first hit, everybody was scrambling, running around, going to the grocery store, taking everything off the shelves, whether you needed it or not. So there was a lot of chaos around, will we have food throughout this pandemic? So we wanted to ensure that if this pandemic was to get worse, then our community have the seeds that they need in order to grow their own food.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember that chaos, and even in some instances, going to the local nursery and seeds being out of stock as well. So also knowing that you all not just provided them with resources, but resources that were also seemingly scarce in that moment as well. Heather, was there anything else that you would like to add to this particular question?
The only thing I would add is there oftentimes around discussions related to climate, there again is the use of the word emergency and the need to act really quickly. And for the most part, I see completely the intersectionality that we've talked about with climate issues and food issues. But I note that, in Montgomery County, we're having a current discussion around solar panels being placed in our agricultural reserve, which is kind of a nationally recognized model for land preserved for farming. And there are some interesting challenges around that about how that will limit affordable land access even further, and how that will make it difficult to not only pay for the land, but then also to have the land that is currently under farming repurposed for solar instead. And so there's certainly a way to make it work and to do it, but there is a need to, while also acting urgently, think thoughtfully and ensure that the implications of the policies that are pursued are thoughtfully considered and reflect community voice as well, because that's particularly hard during the pandemic, is really having opportunities for residents to engage on how legislative issues will personally impact them. But I also would note too that just if everybody is getting food that is produced locally, that's nutritious food, there is fewer environmental impacts from that, greater health benefits, and greater economic impacts as well for our local small businesses and for our local economies. So I think local procurement really does show how climate and food are reflecting a lot of the same priorities.
No, I mean, I definitely agree. So there's another legislative priority that's coming out of the state that looks at requiring plant-based food options in hospitals and state correctional facilities, and improving the health care for people who are incarcerated by providing lifestyle medicine training information to healthcare providers in prisons and in hospitals. This legislation was spearheaded by the NAACP and the Maryland Plant-Based Advocates for Advocates Coalition, excuse me. Why is this sort of legislation important, and what types of implication does it have on racial justice? And this is, pretty much legislation that focuses on providing wholesale procurement around plant-based food options, and then also ensuring that individuals who may not have as much access or decision-making ability in certain instances, how can they be able to also have access to healthy food as well? So Heather?
Building on the prior discussion about procurement challenges, nutritious food that's locally produced, especially produce and things, that's just more expensive, and that's our systems are set up to prioritize less expensive food, and by creating policies that either mandate or incentivize diets like plant-based diets that may be more expensive to implement, is a way to really ensure that that those priorities are pursued, especially in settings where many people are getting their primary source of nutrition. So that's hospitals, that's schools, and correctional facilities, as you shared. And so there are, I think legislation like that is really critical in order to ensure that people have access to meals that will help fight diet-related diseases, which we know disproportionately affect people of color. And so I think that plant-forward diets, as we like to call them, and I think so often as we're talking about terminology, when we say plant-forward, people think that means, veganism. And in fact, I think plant forward means that even just substituting one meal a week can make a significant difference in a person's health. So I think that initiatives like that are really critical to ensure that our governments are investing in those types of policies.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and even in thinking about the idea of plant forward and reducing some of the overall meat consumption that we have. And I imagine, Sha'Von, this is some of the work that you all also focus on in the Black, with your organization, and thinking about some of you mentioned the culturally relevant food. And so, and going back through some historic cookbooks, it was like, oh, people didn't always eat meat every day. Like that was not always a traditional staple of the American diet. And so in thinking about how we can reconnect to some of our more culturally appropriate food ways and the culturally appropriate food practices that our families, from whichever backgrounds have had for generations, thinking about how implementing some of those practices may allow us to still, find the connection between food justice and food sovereignty, and also between, climate justice and climate action. Alice or Sha'Von, would you all like to, provide any additional comments on the question of, why is legislation important for local food procurement and also for requiring plant-based food options in hospitals and state correctional facilities?
Just a short and quick answer. I think policy like this is very important, especially with the lens and the training around lifestyle medicine training. And I also would like to acknowledge the fact of how communities became food insecure in the first place, right? There is a strong correlation between food deserts, food apartheid areas, healthy food priority areas, and the redlining map. That happened because of the predatory lending habits from the banking industry. And then also, there is some data that reveals, like, regardless of the income level of a neighborhood, if the neighborhood is predominantly Black, grocery stores are less likely to be placed there or to be operating in those neighborhoods. So I think, like, understanding those root causes that thusly, or that then will eventually create those lifestyle choices. I think lifestyle choices are created because of your environment that you are in. If you look at certain neighborhoods in Baltimore, or like look around the York Road corridor, one side of York Road has a life expectancy that is much greater than the other side of York Road. And that's because of the food retail outlets and the resources that's located around those particular neighborhoods. So in the spirit of like food sovereignty, I'm gonna keep pushing this, because that's where my spirit is. So in the spirit of like food sovereignty, it's getting back to like studying those root causes and then providing those informed practices to allow people to then define what culturally appropriate is, right? I'm not a vegetarian, but I think this plant-based policy is important for people who are vegetarians, right? But for people who are not vegetarians, or for people who are from the South, like I'm from the deep South. So one thing that I love green tomatoes. So like looking through that in like a food sovereignty lens is like, if you are catering to my community, then you got to ensure that you have these things that caters to the specific cultural needs of the community that you are seeking to help.
Alice, is there anything else that you wanted to add? Thank you, Sha'Von.
Yeah, I think Sha'Von and Heather both brought up really great points. And I guess one more thing I would say is just the importance of getting feedback from the people who are receiving services from these places. Primarily, thinking about which communities are most impacted by mass incarceration and which communities are most impacted by hospitalizations, right? And figuring out in the midst of looking at plant-based diets, kind of to Sha'Von's point, like what are the preferences of these communities, and integrating health into that, but also culturally appropriate foods. And I will say one of the other things is just, how are we making informed decisions? And I would say I wanted to lift up, there's an OSI fellow, his name is Kanav Kathoria, and he is heading up something called the Farm to Prison Project. And he's been working with some of these institutions and speaking with some women I think in the Jessup location, trying to understand what their preferences are and what they've experienced in terms of the meals that they're getting. And so I think in addition to, as we talk about policy, to really understand on the ground, what people are experiencing and what people are saying, and how that continues to inform the policies that are being presented and are being lifted up.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think these are all very key. I mean, when I think about food justice, racial justice, climate justice, and Sha'Von mentioned some of the conditions and the root causes in those conditions. It's often ends up being individuals who because of structural design lack power, and they're unable to. They lack power because the system was designed for them to not be able to have as much influence and power. So being able to take the time to gain feedback and to have those conversations elicits a sense of when residents or individuals who are most impacted now begin to have voice and agency again in the process, to be able to actually start to describe and define their futures again. So I mean, I really do just want to highlight that and bring that out. So thank you for bringing that up. So we're going to shift now just to some questions around what are some of the barriers that you see to actually achieving food justice and food sovereignty. Each of you all come from completely different perspectives. Alice, you're in local government, which might have its own set of challenges. Heather, you work just outside of government, and Sha'Von, you work definitely as I don't want to say anti-government, but it is in a very unique, we would call it in planning like a radical planning, embedded planning tradition. And so can you all just talk about what some of the challenges are that you all see in your work, and those who want to have more agency in the process? So Sha'Von, feel free to take this question.
Yeah, I can kick it off. So there is a group in Baltimore. So there's two groups in Baltimore who are doing really phenomenal work around like food equity, Black Yogi Institute and the Baltimore Farm Alliance. So one of the things that they are working on is community control of land. I think that is so important for communities to have access to arable land that you can actually farm and grow food on, especially in urban environments. So that is one issue. One issue is lack of farmable land in urban areas. So they're having a community conversation starting next week around how can policy be shifted to support community-owned land.
thank you for bringing up the concept of, or the need for land access and for people to be able to own land in order to start thinking about how they can, have more agency in the food system. Alice or Heather, any comments that you all would like to add in?
Yeah, I can add a couple things. I think to Sha'Von's point about land and land access, I think from a city perspective, I don't personally work on this, but I have colleagues who do, where we think about land tenure. And, in the past, there's been strategies around, there's these vacant properties and empty space in the city, why don't we lease it to communities? And I think there's a lot of conversation now where we're seeing initially, this 5-year lease was a really good strategy, but after 5 years, then what? After 5 years, communities put a lot of sweat and, personal effort and heart into what they're doing to transform the space, and to be 5 years later realizing they could potentially lose it after they put so much into it. I think one of the things we're trying to figure out is, what does long-term land tenure look like? And that it's not just a 5-year lease, but what does it look like to make it even longer, so that it really does feel like more like ownership. So I think that's one of the conversations that we're having within city government. I think some of the other barriers, I would say, is just how do we make sure that the decisions we're making are being informed by residents? And so I think within our office, we're trying to do something around that. We have something that we do called resident food equity advisors, where every year we have a different cohort focusing on a different topic. So for example, our last cohort was on corner stores, and we were really looking at different residents who have some experience on the ground with that. This cohort, currently, we're looking at food planning within housing authority and public housing spaces. And we've been working closely with a lot of residents, public housing residents, and getting their thoughts on how food plays a role in how they're living and the way that they're accessing that, and even the land and the property that they're on for public housing, and how food plays out in that. So I think that there's a lot in terms of how are we capturing some of these voices and really getting their input as we are presenting, potential things and potential policy recommendations to people further up the chain, I guess. And also figuring out how do we give people access to these policymakers and to these decision makers. And so I think that's something that we've been trying to figure out in terms of a lot of this conversation is like, are we gatekeepers, and how do we keep ourselves from, like, are we unintentionally or intentionally keeping people from being heard, and how do we create more avenues so that people are being heard for the people who actually can make certain decisions? And so I think those are some of the things that we've been thinking about as we continue to think through food justice and racial equity.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. And I want to say, I'm just going to put like a plug out there. So I first met Alice, I think it was in 2018. It was at an APA conference in Washington, D.C., and you presented on some of the equitable work that you all have been doing around community engagement. It's the Baltimore Planning Academy. And I think that definitely highlights and speaks to just some of the other really great avenues of how you can bring in resident voices. So Tara Yoso has an article that talks about whose culture has capital, and it talks about navigational capital, which is this ability to navigate through bureaucracy. And so to see that your organization, and that the Baltimore Office of Planning has been using, their institutional knowledge to support residents to understand how the process works so that they can then provide feedback into the process, I definitely think is a great way to show agency, to assist residents with reclaiming their agency. So thank you for highlighting those comments. Heather, is there anything else that you would like to add?
The only thing that might be worth sharing is that, and I appreciate so much everything that's already been shared, but in Montgomery County, one of the kind of key components of the COVID-19 response related to food has been in building hubs around our county. And so our county is both geographically, pretty large, and but then, also with a population of over 1 million residents, recognizing that the strategies that we create or the resources that we're establishing at the county level can never really be tailored or uniquely customized to the challenges and and opportunities at each of those at the community level. And so by partnering primarily with faith communities, for the most part, one is with a repurposed arts facility, recognizing that performance art space is currently not occupied. But there have been 8 hubs that the county has established, providing funding to community organizations in different regions of the county, with a focus on those that are most significantly impacted by COVID infections. And so those are both distribution sites, so they can be for food, but then also for diapers, but also for testing sites and SNAP outreach, access to other medical care, but then also information sharing networks. And so what Alice was indicating as a challenge with how can we really build community feedback and voice into framing the response initiatives. These are also information and feedback sharing loops with each of our county's communities. And so it allows us to have partners throughout the county who can identify the challenges that are happening and communicate them both back to the county government as well as to the nonprofits who are coordinating the countywide response.
All right, thank you. All right, so I think there'll be about 2 more questions that I'll ask, and then we'll definitely open it up for the panel. We have questions starting to come, open up from questions from the audience. We have questions coming in from the audience now, so if you have any more questions, feel free to add them in. All right, so who are some individuals or groups who are involved in food justice work that are inspiring to you, and what drew you to this food movement, in the first place? So Alice?
Yeah, well, I think Sha'Von already mentioned a lot of the groups that I find very inspiring in our area. I think Black Yield, I think they've kind of been always spearheading a lot of this conversation around food apartheid, food sovereignty, and really pivoting the conversation to really challenge people in terms of why use the term food desert and what is the purpose of that term and how do we change the narrative. I think Dr. Brown and his work with the Black Church Food Security Network has always been something I've been a huge fan of, and his vision, and even just, I feel like even during COVID, they've been doing a lot of these panels and online platform conversations, really trying to pivot some of this conversation and even helping people think about what is an emergency response. And how do we really think about hunger from a more nuanced perspective, and really thinking about, should we be completely and totally dependent on food pantries and food banks in terms of emergency response? And so I think in terms of that, those have been really great partners. And I think Farm Alliance also, they've been doing a lot to try to support and create funding for BIPOC farmers and people who are doing that within Baltimore City. I think some of the, in terms of just, what first drew me to kind of this work, I actually did not have a food background when I first started this position. I actually was in the substance abuse world, and I was doing a lot of substance abuse research and intervention and throughout Baltimore City at inpatient, outpatient, methadone clinics, all of those. And I just remember there would be mornings that like grandmothers would come and pick up, methadone and would bring their grandkids with them. And the grandkids would sit in the lobby and would be drinking orange soda and potato chips, early in the morning. This was like 7, 8 a.m., and it was just so interesting. It was just such a different, lifestyle that I saw, and just kind of being like, I understand scheduling and capacity and resources, but just kind of thinking like, is this really, like, could we do better than this? And I think that was something I was thinking about a lot as I was working at these clinics throughout the city. And then I think the other piece that really does challenge how I think about this work is actually when I had first started working at the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative. It really occurred to me, I think often Baltimore City seems like a very like binary conversation. And I say binary in the sense of, you talk about there's, the white majority, and then there's, technically in Baltimore City, they're not the majority, but but there's like it's very black and white in how we talk about racial equity. And I think as I started to work in a lot of this, I started to see that there's a lot of immigrants and a lot of people who look like me who are part of this ecosystem, and how do they fit into this dialogue about food justice? And for better or for worse, I think there's certain things that where we people who look like me are part of the challenge and part of the issue, and I think there are some things that, for me is trying to figure out how do we change that narrative, but also thinking about, as we think about racial justice, also thinking about this idea of racial triangulation. We don't have a lot of time to go into that concept right now, but I think there's a lot in terms of how racial triangulation plays a role in the positioning of immigrant communities and the Black community in this larger white supremacy construct of how all of this works. And so I think there is that more nuanced conversation that I feel like I personally want to open up and be of, and really, really figure out how we fold the immigrant experience into this dialogue, and how we create some transformation that can also include that as part of the narrative of Baltimore City. And when you see a lot of the corner store owners and the influx of different demographics that come in, if you look at it, it's very parallel to a lot of the wars that are happening around the world. And wherever a lot of conflict is happening, you'll see this immigrant influx coming into these urban areas. And so I think there's a lot to be said about how we can think about, how we think about food justice and how we expand that story. And so I think that's something that I have personally been more and more, I guess, compelled and convicted to dig into and try to kind of tackle in this larger context.
Thank you. Heather, who excites you in the movement, and what groups got you involved, and what inspires you to do food work?
Well, I have to say, and I'm not saying this in any way because of the panel today, but truly my colleagues in Baltimore provide constant inspiration and ideas and leadership in this in the food space, and both Alice and Holly in the city government and the Black Church Food Security Network. Just Alice and Sha'Von's work have informed our food security community advisory board, looking at the ways that community-led and resident-led coordination just brings so much guidance and inspiration to our work in Montgomery County. And so, first want to note my fellow panelists, but then also I just note in Montgomery County specifically, Crossroads Community Food Network is an organization that works really deeply in one specific community in our county, but really bringing the food system focus in doing the food work. So through their micro enterprise training program, through their farmers market, they were the first farmers market in the country to offer double dollars related to SNAP. And so these different food economic settings really reflect the businesses that are engaged in those in those programs really reflect the diversity of the community and the food pathways of our local residents. And then they also do a lot of food education work. And as Sha'Von noted before, nutrition education and culinary and gardening work is really critical components to food access as well. And so I really appreciate the way they approach the work. And then finally, I think I would just note that there's many providers, as I shared before, in Montgomery County food assistance providers, but one in particular, the Reverend Pat Drumming, she works with the Rainbow Community Development Center. I think the passion that I see in her work in particularly just regularly inspires me. And so my work is sitting behind a desk and at a computer. And there were so many times when, she would share that in the middle of the night, she got a call that there was a truckload of peaches that was available. And if she went and picked it up right at that minute, she could go and get it and distribute it to the residents that she works with. And so she did in the middle of the night, and that happens every day in the work that she does. And I cannot imagine the amount of energy and heart that it takes to do that, and so many challenges with the residents that she works with, and she will do anything to get them connected to whatever resources they need. And that passion and dedication just really inspires me to do everything that I can to ensure that those organizations are connected with the resources and support that they need to continue to do that work.
Thank you. Thank you. Sha'Von?
I would like to start off with what drew me to the work. So I come from a lineage of farmers. I am originally from the deep South, Georgia. And my granddad was actually one of the farmers who lost his land, or whose land was taken because of predatory loans from the USDA and other agencies. So I feel like this work is kind of ancestral to me, because I am reclaiming what was taken from me, or what was forcibly taken from my family. So those connections is drawing me to the work, just connecting with farmers. And when we started our food distribution program called the Black Church Supported Agriculture, one of the farmers who we source meat from said that our order has been his largest order yet. He has been in business since 2016. So that really made me feel good that we are actually making an impact in the farmers' lives that we come in contact with, and that we are in community with, because there are shared benefits in our relationships. And then individuals who I would like to lift up. So I would like to highlight two authors. I turned my screen off to go get these books. Freedom Farmers, written by Dr. Monica White. This is a phenomenal book. I literally read this book in one day. It's so good. And this book highlights agricultural resistance, the history of it, because this movement is not new. Our ancestors and those who came before us actually laid the blueprint for the work that we are doing today. This book highlights the work of Fannie Lou Hamer, who established Freedom Farm Cooperatives in Sunflower County, Mississippi. And she did phenomenal work, established a food bank, had an intentional community. So when you talk about urban planning and community planning, she did that with a cooperative in the 60s. And then the second book that I want to highlight, written by Dr. Ashante Reese, Black Food Geographies. So this book highlights the interconnections of food insecurity, food access, and redlining. It shows how it's impacted and how it shapes the resources and communities.
Thank you. Those are definitely highly recommended books that I would definitely encourage, if you have not taken the time to read those, to read those about food, and also, you know, the story of your grandfather's land loss is a very recurring story in some of the conversations around food equity, food access, and wanting to have a push towards food sovereignty. All right, so we have about 7 minutes left of our discussion today. Time has really gone by very quickly. I'm still, I can ask you all 1,000 more questions, but this is a question from the floor, is directed to Heather. So as you work on the food equity issue, and I'll open it up to anyone else as well, how do you balance the need to plan for food production in Montgomery County, particularly in your agricultural reserve, and accommodating solar energy goals by allowing some of the ag reserve to be used for solar energy productions? What are some of your rules or guidelines? And this is definitely a very technical question. And I think this is, and I know this comes from some concerns between wanting to promote solar power and solar energy. And when we see a lot of that happening, ends up being in some of our more rural and in some cases, our more ideal farmland where we would have farm production and food production. So how do you all balance that in Montgomery County?
Thank you for that question. And I will say that it is an issue still well under development and with lots of moving parts. So it's hard to know exactly what that zoning text amendment will look like in the end. But a couple of the considerations that we've put forward are recognizing that the land is going to be exceptionally valuable if solar is put on that land. Is there a way that there can be some type of financial mechanism to capture some of the money that is invested in the land for this purpose, and then redirect it to land access investments instead. So is there a way that that could then set aside more land, as I shared before, specifically for production of culturally diverse crops for BIPOC farmers, for establishing more food production in our agricultural reserve? And I think that's one of the things that's actually held up, is there's not necessarily lots of food that's being produced in the agricultural reserve right now. But that's something that we've been working really hard to change, and we want to go in that direction. We're also looking at things like soil classification. So could it be potentially the food that is not really prime for food production that could be used for solar? And then there's also a lot of discussion around voltaics. I'm still getting used to that term myself, but there's not a lot of good understanding of how you can produce food under solar panels. So we talk about grazing, potentially having pollinator gardens and habitats, but it's hard to know exactly what that looks like. And if we're expecting farmers to make that adaptation, then how can we get them the technical assistance and the training that they would need, as well as the resources that they would need and the financial investments to be able to do to farm in that way, potentially instead or in addition to. So that's just a couple of the things that we've been thinking about. But it is very complicated, and it would be ideal if we could find a way to hopefully do a little bit of both, but not in any way go down that slippery slope of putting aside land that could be used for food production.
All right, thank you. We have another question come in. Are there any organizations or government programs that give lectures or sessions on home gardening? It would be great to have this program. So I know, so if you all want to share, what are some of the things that you all are doing in your respective jurisdictions? I know, Sha'Von, your organization does do some YouTube videos, and if we were not in a social distancing atmosphere, you all would be doing some workshops as well. So can you all just talk about maybe some programs or organizations in your respective jurisdictions that support people with taking lessons on home gardening and growing for themselves?
So one other organization is the Extension Office. I think the first point of contact is to always reach out to your Extension office because they have a lot of virtual trainings, virtual workshops, and they also have the Master Gardener program, and they have scholarships available. So you can become a Master Gardener to learn about soil, to learn about pest management, to learn the whole slew of gardening that I can't speak of. But so during the pandemic, we have shifted, and we actually have videos on YouTube about how to start seeds inside, how to read a seed packet. And the name of our YouTube channel is called the Black Church Food Security Network. And we also have videos about food preservation. So if you're interested in turning cucumbers into pickles, peaches into jams, tomatoes into tomato sauce, then you should check out our YouTube channel as well.
Yeah, I was going to echo everything Sha'Von said. I think the Master Gardener program through Extension is really instrumental for a lot of folks. And so I would reach out to them. I think in Baltimore City, our contact is Neith Little. So I'm not sure exactly where you're putting, like where exactly you're asking your question from, but we can definitely put the name of that organization and the name of the contact in there in the chat.
Yeah, and we're getting some requests. So if everyone, for our panelists, if you all would like to just put your name and include your organization in the chat box, that would also be great as well. So last question. So do you have any, or what parting words do you have for our audience members today who want to support the food justice movement in the DC region? How can they get involved? How can they start to make our food system a more equitable food system? Heather, if you would like to start off with that today.
Yes, thank you for that. So I think the main thing that I would share is first, finding ways that we in our own home, in our own households, in our own communities can certainly pursue a lot of the strategies that we talk about from a policy perspective. And so that's something that we really strive to dedicate a lot of our efforts in, but then also, and I didn't share how I got connected to this work, but really for me, it's about people and relationships, and the cross-sector work that we do as well. So making sure that we're building stronger relationships between food and mental health and wellness and housing, and economic opportunity and workforce development. And I think that is where I see a lot of our work headed, is building the bridges between food and all the other aspects of residents' lives.
Thank you. Alice?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we hear from a lot of our partners is access to funding and needing a lot of support. And I think for a lot of folks who are trying to, create, food sovereignty, I think there is this tension of, they want to create their own autonomy, and yet they're depending on grant funding to keep their work going. And I think that's some of the things that I would say is, donate to these organizations, to the groups, and donate directly. I think it's one thing to donate to these larger these larger philanthropic groups, but I think it's another thing to just give your support directly to these organizations who need that support. And so I would say support, give them manpower. I think there's a lot of things too where we see that a lot of these organizations that have a lot of vision, they need a lot of technical support. Not everyone who has this vision, like we all have different sets, right, in what we offer to a group. And I think for a lot of groups, there's a need for a lot of technical skill, whether you know how to write grants, whether you have a lot of admin skills, helping to organize, helping to keep data together, and so I would say in order to get more involved, give some time, give some resources into these groups and support the work that they're doing that way.
Thank you. And Sha'Von?
Yeah, I, again, will co-sign with what Alice has said. And I will add to study. Study the community that you are in. Study the community that you are aiming to support. And I am in the process of dropping a link in the chat box. So we are hosting a In Hunger training every Thursday this month from 6:30 to 7:30-ish, because sometimes it goes over because the conversation is just so rich. And last month we talked about agricultural resistance. So like what was highlighted, or if you read Freedom Farmers, what would be highlighted in Freedom Farmers, and then how can we learn from our past in order to create sustainable solutions. This Thursday, we will actually talk about asset-based mapping, because I think a lot of the work that a lot of organizations do is from the model of like, we have to fix, we don't have the resources that we need. So we're actually hosting a training around how can we use what we have and leverage that in order to create the systems that we need.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so very much for taking time with us today to talk about your backgrounds in food justice and how we can work to move the DC metro region to be a more equitable food system, and to have a more equitable food system, and to also to think about food sovereignty and our individual roles in that, and then also our collective roles. So with that, I think that is the end of our discussion for today. And I will turn it back over to the Siege Lab for any closing remarks or for closeouts. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
All righty. So we can I'll just end the conversation and I'll stop recording if that's okay. And thank you all. And I believe there'll be another session available, or that will be starting, I believe, at 4:10. Have a great day, everyone.